Good morning. I'm pleased to present Alberta's results for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Last year was another remarkable year for our province's economy. We marked solid growth while facing incredible challenges, with new opportunities for prosperity for every Albertan. I'm happy to say that for the third consecutive year, we balanced the provincial budget and reported a surplus of $4.3 billion. That is roughly $1.9 billion more than was projected in the 2023 budget. This was no small feat. Our province and our economy are directly impacted by global uncertainties, fluctuating oil prices, and increased risk from natural disasters and emergencies. But Alberta was a beacon of opportunity amongst the challenges that face governments across Canada and around the world. We provided the highest ever funding to healthcare and ensured our children had access to the best teachers in schools. Kept Albertans and communities safe during last year's record-breaking wildfire season, and supported farmers as they faced drought conditions throughout the province. We provided targeted relief payments that went to families, seniors, and vulnerable groups to help with the high cost of living. Plus, we indexed personal income taxes and social support programs. Alberta's tax advantage is being maintained as well, with new legislation that guarantees Albertans and businesses won't see their income tax rates rise without approval through a referendum. And still, beyond supporting these important priorities and programs for Albertans, we repaid maturing debt and put aside meaningful savings that will create prosperity for our kids and grandkids. Alberta broke population growth records in 2023. 56,000 people from other parts of Canada chose to come to Alberta in 2023, and another 113,000 moved here from around the world. That's like adding another Red Deer and another Fort McMurray to our province. We have good jobs, good wages, low taxes, and more opportunity than other provinces. Employment grew 3.6% in Alberta last calendar year, exceeding the national growth rate of 2.4%. Alberta gained 85,000 new jobs, mostly in full-time and in the private sector. In fact, nearly 90% of the private sector jobs created across Canada in the last 6 months were here in Alberta. But we know that rapid population growth has brought challenges. Rapid population growth has put pressure on government programs, services, and infrastructure, and also fueled strong demand for housing. That drove up house prices and rents. Rising interest rates and the price of groceries have put pressure on Alberta households in 2023. Through it all, our government has stepped up to meet the needs of Albertans, and as responsible stewards of Alberta's finances, we are building long-term economic sustainability and stability for our children and grandchildren. In the 2023-2024 fiscal year, revenue was $74.7 billion and expense was $70.4 billion, leaving us with a $4.3 billion surplus. As I mentioned before, the surplus is $1.9 billion more than we estimated in Budget 2023. Supported by narrower light-heavy oil differential, record oil production, and more people and businesses moving to and investing in our province. In terms of revenue, Alberta's strong labor market drove up personal income tax revenue even after we indexed rates to inflation to keep more money in Albertans' pockets. Corporate income taxes continued to be solid, while we maintain the lowest rate in the country. This proves how Alberta's low-tax environment is key to economic growth and activity. We are making our province a destination of choice and possibility. Non-renewable resource revenues came in higher than predicted at budget as a result of a narrower light-heavy differential and a lower exchange rate. The price of oil landed at an average of $77.83 US per barrel of WTI. We are committed to Albertans and will continue to consider the best options to help reduce costs for taxpayers. By carefully considering each spending decision today, we keep our finances on track and sustainable. Expense in 23-24 was $70.4 billion. This was higher than forecast in Budget 2023, mainly due to helping Albertans with the impacts of wildfires, floods, and severe drought. We provided $3 billion in disaster and emergency funds. This included $851 million to fight wildfire. Another $1.9 billion in agricultural support went to producers, farmers, and ranchers devastated by the drought, the second they have faced in 3 years. Significant investments were made in the healthcare system, improving primary care, supporting our superb health workforce, and keeping patients at the center of everything we do. In addition, support was provided to address enrollment growth in Alberta schools and boost learning supports for the most vulnerable students. We built apprenticeship opportunities in post-secondary institutions so more young people can consider the trades. And we spent $6.3 billion on our capital plan in 23-24. Building Alberta supports jobs and attracts skilled workers. Expanding our roads and bridges opens up local economies and grows communities. More schools, modernized hospitals, art and rec centers, all these facilities help keep Alberta vibrant and thriving. After final calculations and adjustments, we ended the year with $7.3 billion in surplus cash, including $5.3 billion from 2022-2023. This always sounds like a huge amount, and indeed it is. But without careful planning, that cash can all too quickly disappear. That is why we continue to stick to our fiscal framework to guide our decisions. As mandated in that framework, we're allocating half, or $3.7 billion, of the surplus cash to debt repayment. Our focused plan allowed us to pay $1.7 billion in debt in 23-24 and will enable us to use an additional $2 billion in cash from 23-24 to repay debt in 24-25. Of the remaining $3.7 billion in surplus cash that is allocated to the Alberta Fund, $2 billion will be deposited in the Heritage Fund in 2024-2025. This will grow the Heritage Fund to around $25 billion. And year over year, as we retain all investment earnings in the fund instead of transferring them out for general revenue, we will continue to see progress. Taxpayers supported debt was $81.8 billion as of March 31st, 2024, $2.5 billion higher than in 2023. And debt servicing costs were $3.1 billion in 2023-2024. As communicated in Budget 24, there was a strategic decision to pre-borrow $4.3 billion this past year for significant debt maturities that came due in a short period in early 24-25. These funds are being set aside in a debt retirement account and cannot be used for any other purpose. Costs like these are why we remain committed to pay down debt whenever possible and keep those costs from escalating even higher. Overall, net financial debt is $41.4 billion in 23-24, an improvement of $4.3 billion from the prior year. Alberta continues to be the least indebted province in the country. While today's focus is on looking back, it's important to emphasize that with every choice our government makes, we are building a better future for Alberta. Our Premier has promised we will grow the Heritage Fund to between $250 billion and $400 billion by 2050, which will transform the Heritage Fund into a source of intergenerational wealth and prosperity. Through wise investments, we intend to share more of today's good fortunes with future generations. Our economy and our government's fiscal position are strong, and we will support both. This will continue to earn us credit rating upgrades that provide us lower borrowing costs and more money for the things that matter to Albertans. It will help us maintain our tax advantage to continue to attract investors and more jobs. It will continue to draw people to Alberta as the best place to live, work, and raise a family. We will continue to be the economic engine of Canada with a resilient economy that can face any challenges down the line. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Minister. We'll start with questions on the floor, and then we'll move to the phone. Please, as you ask your question, identify your name, which outlet you're from, and we will go with one question and one follow-up. So we'll start on the floor. Joanne, go ahead.
Yeah, Shaylin Sposki with CTV News in Edmonton. The big takeaway for a lot of people seeing the headlines today will see $4.3 billion surplus or a 7.3 cash surplus, and yet they won't be feeling any benefit as a result of that. So I guess in the simplest and most succinct way, I guess explain why the money was spent the way it was and why it wasn't put towards anything in terms of affordability measures for Albertans.
Well, I think if you go back to the first time I got to answer questions of you folks a year ago, I think the surplus at that time was predicted to be $2.2 billion. And at that time, oil was below forecast. And I think the questions I was getting at that time were, what are you going to cut? And I said, you know, first quarter is usually an outlier. Let's get further into the year and understand where we sit. But with our fiscal framework, it provides a lot of rigidity around the decisions that we make around budget. So it provides upside for the province when some of these sensitivities go in our favor, whether that's WTI or the exchange rate. And with the fiscal framework in place, it allows us to ensure that that upside goes to things that will benefit all Albertans now and in the future, which is either savings, debt repayment, or a one-time spend that doesn't drive the operating line. So I think the answer is by forecasting prudently, budgeting prudently, that is the biggest advantage for Albertans today and tomorrow.
And just as a follow-up, it's slightly unrelated to today's update, but I just want to ask about the fuel tax. Will there be any, I know WTI, I think as of last night, looking around $84. So I guess just in terms of any changes that we can expect and any relief at the pump ahead of July 1st.
I believe, I haven't checked in a couple hours, but I think WTI is at about 81.70 today. The average for the monitoring period coming up before July 1st was about 77.80. So there will be no relief coming July 1st.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Sure. So Catherine Yurkowski, Alberta Today. So compared to 2022-23, revenue was down 1.4 billion, but spending was up 5.9 billion. So if this continues, it's going to be pretty tough to stick to that no deficit requirement for the fiscal framework. So what do you think has to change?
Well, I think prudent budgeting going forward, as we showed in the out years, we're still predicting surpluses in the out years. And so we'll monitor that new information going forward. Obviously, there will be pressures with population growth like we're seeing, but we are seeing increases in personal income tax as well as very stable corporate income tax lines. So it'll all have to be assessed as we roll into the next budget.
And in the, you had mentioned the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and I know coming up in the fall, you're looking at some new rules for that. The Premier has said there's a potential to use that fund to de-risk investments, but I'm wondering how do you grow to that $250 to $400 billion mark if you're spending to de-risk investments so the private sector doesn't want to touch?
Well, I look forward to being able to communicate a little more openly in the fall when we unveil our plan and strategy. But I would say that for this to be successful, it has to be a return-seeking endeavor. That has to be the bottom line. Highest and best governance around the world and return-seeking.
Graham Thompson at the Star. Just to follow up on that. So then the province will be then using the trust fund to as the Premier said, assist in de-risking projects. So that's something you're going to do. You'll be using the trust fund, as the Premier pointed out a few days ago.
It's my expectation, and like I said, I'll be able to communicate this more clearly in the fall, is that the fund will have to be return-seeking. That wouldn't preclude it from investing in Alberta in a strategic way, potentially, but it has to be return-seeking. Highest government's best rate of return.
But that's still a risk then. So you're saying the fund right now does do investments, but with the Premier talking about them potentially then investing in Alberta, is the risk here we're putting too many eggs in one basket then with the fund?
Well, I think that would be a question for the management of the fund at the time, which will become a lot more clear, Graham, as we roll into the fall. But like I said, it has to be return-seeking. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, supplementary. So I do have supplementary. Something I think I've asked you before. I've asked previous finance ministers going back decades. But more recently, there's been talk, of course, when Travis Takes was the finance minister, about a panel, blue ribbon panel, looking at revenue. You know, you're looking at cutting back in 2019 revenue. The panel looking at that. You know, we're on this roller coaster still. We have to get off the roller coaster. Are you looking then at actually putting together a blue ribbon panel looking at revenue for Alberta?
I think it would be a good idea for Alberta to do that at some point in the future. I don't have any concrete plans to do that in this mandate. But I would point to the fact that we constantly do it as a department and a government. And I would point to some of the increases that you saw in Budget 24, maybe specifically around land titles.
Thanks. We'll go to the phones for a couple of questions. We'll come back to the floor. Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
Thank you. The first question from Rick Bell from Post Media. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Good day, Minister. I want to go back to sort of a variation of the first question that was asked here today. So it looks like there's not going to be a break on the fuel tax. I think you said that, just to be clear, if you could reiterate that. And there's obviously not going to be an income tax cut yet. And you're talking about all these wonderful things that are happening to the economy, but a lot of people aren't feeling it because I don't really care how many people have Ontario plates moving to Calgary or how many people from BC are flipping their houses and moving to Alberta. So what do you tell people when they say, where is our tangible benefit, personal tangible benefit to all of this wonderful economic news?
Okay, well, I'll start at the beginning on fuel tax. You know, we've got the legislation in place. I think it's a very defensible program. If you follow along, when WTI does break 80 for the monitoring period that's leading up to the change on the quarter, that relief will come on automatically. So although we're over 80 today, you know, going out 3 months past July 1st, it may very well be there. And like I said, that's defensible because when oil is that high, we know that we're going to make it back on the royalty side, and it means that that's when fuel prices are logically the highest, when oil's high. When it comes to, you know, tangible benefits for Albertans, I think the point of the fiscal framework is that in the good and decent years, we don't waste it. We don't ratchet up spending and then see oil go down to $45 and bring forward a $30 billion deficit. So this is about stability for Albertans who do enjoy the lowest taxes and highest wages in the country, and as the stats show, the most opportunity.
You have a follow-up, Rick?
Yes, I do. So just to be clear, the sort of a two-part supplementary. One, just to be clear, the fuel tax, there is no fuel tax break coming July 1. And number two, people are still, many people are still, you know, the Alberta Advantage that I remember from 20 years ago has largely disappeared. The affordability is not there anymore. We have rents going up. We have people having difficulty paying mortgages, all of the things that you see. I mean, what do you say to those people who are struggling with affordability issues even here? Because they don't want to hear about the GDP as X, Y, Z, or so many people are moving to Alberta. That's not them. They are living here already, and they already have a job, but they're still finding it hard to make ends meet. And could you clarify whether the fuel tax is on or off come July 1? Thanks.
So to be totally clear, there will be no change in the fuel tax July 1st. And what I would say to those Albertans is I understand and get it and see it. I know that there's challenges, but I think coming back to our job and role as government is to ensure that we can keep the advantages that we have going forward. It's easy for some governments to turn to taxes and want to raise taxes to expand services and spending. We're committed to not doing that. So that means that we have to be prudent in how we budget and forecast. And if there is upside, it does help Albertans. You saw the credit rating upgrades that we've seen over the last years, driving down our cost of borrowing. We're trying to manage that debt responsibly while investing in the Heritage Fund. And you see our net debt position is improving, even though we're pre-borrowing to deal with these large debt stacks that are maturing this year and the big stack in 25. So this is about sustainability and being stable going forward.
Thank you. Operator, can you put through the next caller?
Thank you. The next question is from Don Braid from the Calgary Herald. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Minister, about last December, you and the Premier started talking about deficits. You said there was going to be danger of deficits, and then we found out that there wasn't going to be any income tax break this year after all, even though it was your absolute signpost promise in the election, and there was never anything said about phasing it in half in 26 and the rest in 27. I wonder how you justify that now when you're sitting on a $4.2 billion surplus and projections of surpluses into the future as well, smaller, but who knows, they could be huge. It looks to me like after the election's over, you just didn't want to spend this money, Minister. What do you say?
Well, I'd say it's important to differentiate between looking back at the year that we were just in. And when I talked to you in December, Mr. Braid, I was speaking specifically about the challenges of Budget 24, which were challenging. So if you take all things being equal, if I would have brought in the promised tax cut that we will bring in its entirety in Budget 2024, we would have ran around a $1.1 billion deficit, which I can't do thanks to the fiscal framework and prudent planning.
Do you have a follow-up, Don?
Yes, my understanding is that the cost of the program would have been about $1.5 billion a year. You've got a $4.2 billion surplus, so I don't see how spending that in the sense of not collecting tax would lead you into a deficit.
So you're imagining a scenario where it would have been brought in Budget 2023 then, I would suggest, Don. And so that didn't happen, and I was forced to deal with, the realities of 23, 24, but looking forward into Budget 24, which you're right, it's about $1.4 billion, the total hit to the tax cut. So like I said, in Budget 24, it would have been a $1.1 billion deficit.
Thank you. Operator, we'll take one more from the phones and we'll come back to the floor.
But I would just add, nobody wants to bring in the tax cut more than me, more than the Premier. And if things change and we're able to accelerate that timeline, I will be the first be the first to put that on the floor.
Go ahead, Operator.
Thank you. The next question is from Carrie Tate from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Minister, the spending in the last year ended up increasing by about 9% as sort of the government managed this population increase and inflation. How do you, given that big jump in spending, how do you plan to contain it in the future?
Well, I think it's important to look at the actual operational spend increases that you see in the budgets. So in Budget 24, I think our average operational increase was 3.9%, even though we increased health and education by 4.4%. This is Budget 2024 I'm talking, looking forward. But when you're looking back at this year, obviously $3 billion in disaster spending makes a big difference. As I mentioned in my speech, about $850 million spent on fighting the wildfire. But the wildfire, the total cost with support to evacuees and disaster relief programs was about $1.1 billion, and then about $1.9 billion in crop insurance indemnities and topping up the fund. So I think important to really differentiate those things.
You have a follow-up, Carrie?
Yeah, thank you. So in light of sort of looking at that $3 billion for disaster relief, is that to say that the government views the disaster, the contingency spend, that type of thing, as one-off, or as rather something that will come up every year, just perhaps in different form?
Well, I don't think you want, the contingency is not just meant to be for disaster spending. It's meant to be a voted fund that government can use to deal with other pressures as well. This was a challenging year to have a wildfire bill that high, coupled with needing to prop up the crop insurance fund. So I would like to look at this as an anomaly, but it is part of the rationale for increasing the contingency to $2 billion in Budget 2024. We want to make sure that we have room to respond.
Thank you. We'll go to the floor one last time, and then we'll return to the phones. Go ahead, Emmanuel.
I missed. Oh, sorry. You go.
Hi, Emmanuel Prestovet, Radio Canada. We're talking a lot about population growth in Alberta. These thousands of people are an increase in revenue for the province, but also an increase in expenses for healthcare and education. When you isolate that these new people, is Alberta spending money on them or making money out of them?
Well, it would be my estimation, and some of that is really lagging data, but it takes time. Even when someone comes buys a house, gets a job. It kind of takes time to get tethered to the job market. It takes time to be in the cycle to pay your taxes here. So there's about an 18-month lag. We do think that it will be a positive for Alberta, but the increased growth does cause real challenges in the short term.
You have a follow-up?
Yep. And in your key objectives, you want Alberta to have a resilient economy, but in the annual report, it acknowledges that Alberta relies heavily on revenues that's volatile and unpredictable. So how can you reconcile these two realities?
Well, I'd say we definitely want a diversified, resilient economy, and that is happening here. You just have to look at aerospace, technology, value-added agri-food production, but in reality, that great opportunity and benefit for Albertans has always been our oil and gas royalties. So when you have something that's that dramatic, 17 billion, 19 billion, that correlates almost directly with the tax advantages that Alberta sees over the next closest province. So it's an opportunity. It's a challenge. It's volatile. You mentioned there's things that are out of our control, but it's also a wonderful benefit.
We'll take one more from the floor.
Thank you. Just a quick one. Do you mind in layman's terms just explaining the difference between the 4.3 surplus and then the 7-ish cash surplus, just for people to understand the difference?
Yes. So there is a difference. So the overall $4.3 billion surplus is our accounting surplus. That takes into account, accounting changes that may be non-cash. For example, the provision on the Sturgeon refinery is what really changed the surplus from third quarter to the actuals now, but that's non-cash. So it didn't impact our cash, and with oil slightly higher, our cash actually increased from third quarter. So when you're looking at the net side, you have to look at the retained earnings in the Heritage Fund, the endowment funds, all of the other things that are part of Alberta's consolidated balance sheet, but cash is very different.
And then recognizing Alberta's ongoing reliance on oil, how difficult is it for you as finance minister to, Premier talks about it a lot, to ride that oil roller coaster revenue when you're trying to future plan?
Well, I think the importance is, and it is, the other finance ministers tell me that this is the toughest job in the country because of that. But I think it's also a great opportunity. But I think you do have to have very prudent forecasting, and I think you have to have conservative forecasting. I know I was asked at the budget, are we conservative enough? And I said that we use industry forecasters and we try to be in the bottom half or bottom third, just to ensure that there is that potential upside, because the downside is unavoidable.
Any more from the floor? We'll take one more from the phone. Operator, can you put through our last caller?
Thank you. Next question is Jackie Carmichael from Edmonton Journal. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Okay. If the UCP government is going to be tucking away almost $4 billion in 2 years into the Heritage Fund at a time when hikes in interest rates have the government also stressing the need to retire debt, why not put that money into retiring provincial debt?
Great question, and I'm glad you asked it, Jackie. So I think it's important, in my view, to look at the net position. When you have the Heritage Fund in its current form, averaging 7% and 8% over a 10-year term, with netted costs out, and you look at our average debt costs currently, it's a benefit to Albertans. Our plan is to even make that difference even more dramatic going forward. So we want prudent management on the debt side to drive down our costs of borrowing, and we want to see increased returns on the Heritage Fund side. And I would equate it, trying to make it relatable. You have RSPs, but you also have a mortgage on your house. In many instances, I doubt you would cash out your RSPs to pay off your mortgage. So it makes sense for the net benefit of the province. Credit rating agencies love it. They're really only concerned about the net position, and they love the fiscal framework. I was in the States last week. It's serving us well.
You have a follow-up, Jackie?
Yeah, the term taxpayer-supported debt of $81.8 billion. Can you explain the difference? What that figure entails?
Right. So that is the debt as it says that is supported by taxpayers. We also have debt that we take on behalf of municipalities and airports, but it's offset because they're paying us back, but they're using our borrowing power at the capital markets. So that's a real difference, and I believe it's at around 17 billion right now. The on lending.
Thank you. Operator, just confirming there are no more callers in the queue.
No more questions, no.
Thank you. That concludes our press conference.
You got some time off this summer? You want to go somewhere?
Not yet, but I'm hoping to be at Calgary Stampede and hopefully get a little time with the family. Yeah. Did you guys get all you need?
I was just going to ask, just as a follow-up, when you said that if things change in terms of accelerating a timeline for the property tax cut, I guess like looking into the crystal ball, and obviously we don't know what can happen, but what would perhaps oil need to be? Like what would need to change? What would the surplus need to look like in the next, say, quarterly update in order for you to accelerate that timeline?
Well, it would be a combination of where the revenue's going and where our expenses are going. So part of the challenge right now is we haven't even received our first quarter submissions from the ministries. So you really have to take that in balance. But if there's room, I think we publicly said that we would bring it forward and legislate it in budget 25 and then bring in to 9% in 26, 8% in 27. If we can accelerate that, we will.
Just in time for the election.
I got a sturgeon refinery question though, because it's
too complicated.
overall it's a good thing when the oil price differential narrows, but it looks a whole lot worse when it comes to sturgeon refinery. Like, how do you feel when you see the changes and the boondoggles of that just get worse and worse?
If I had a DeLorean and I could go back to 2009 when they started talking about this, I think I'd give some sage advice. But we continue to try to make it better on behalf of Albertans. It is a hedge in some ways against oil prices. It works best when diesel's high and inputs are low. But yeah, it continues to be monitored.
Thanks, Minister.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.